this edition of Back in History, we bring to you the story of the Second Liberian Civil War and the events that led to the resignation of Charles Taylor as President of Liberia and his departure to Nigeria on exile. Welcome to this edition of Back in History. The Second Liberian Civil War is the war that lasted in the West African state of Liberia from 1999 to 2003. Recall that the First Liberian Civil War lasted for 8 years, namely from 1989 to 1997. During these years, scores of humans lost their lives. The principal actor in the war was Charles Taylor. He started the First Civil War when he invaded Liberia with the force of arms from neighboring Ivory Coast under the auspices of his militia group known as National Patriotic Front of Liberia, NPFL. His primary mission was to unseat Master Sergeant Samuel Doe at all costs and by all means. Samuel Doe fought back, and what Charles Taylor thought would not last long ended up lasting for about 8 years. In the course of the war, a splinter group led by Prince Johnson arose and also fought for the dethronement of President Samuel Doe. Prince Johnson was a major commander in Charles Taylor's militia group. Samuel Doe was later killed by Prince Johnson's group, but Johnson was not allowed to take over the reins of power without a fight. Charles Taylor and his group fought him ferociously, and Taylor repeatedly maintained that he started the fight for the reclamation of the seat of power from Doe, and that he, Taylor, was the rightful person to succeed Doe and not Prince Johnson. This insistence led to the prolongation of the First Civil War in Liberia, and every effort to secure a ceasefire proved abortive. It took the election of Charles Taylor as President of Liberia for the First Liberian Civil War to be brought to an end. Just when the citizens of Liberia thought that peace had finally and fully returned to Liberia, events began to build up barely 2 years after for what eventually became the Second Liberian Civil War. One of the actions taken by Taylor as President of Liberia was the sponsoring of rebellion in neighboring states to Liberia. He funded rebel groups in Sierra Leone and Guinea. He equally offered them tactical and moral support. This action of Charles Taylor did not go down well with the governments of these countries. They condemned the action of Charles Taylor, and in retaliation, they conceived the plan to invade Liberia by force to unsettle and possibly remove Charles Taylor and his government. Back at home in Liberia, there were also some persons who were anti-Taylor. These persons and groups were still heavily pained by the atrocities committed by the Taylor group, with the pain still fresh in their hearts. In essence, the reason for the Second Liberian Civil War was the man, Charles Taylor. It was a war to retaliate and make governance uncomfortable for him. Guinea, next door neighbor to Liberia, had become victim of Taylor's violent disposition. A lot of atrocities had been carried out on the soils of Guinea by Taylor's NFLR. Guinea thus resolved to retaliate. There emerged a militia group known as Liberians United for Reconciliation and Democracy, known for short as LORD. This group was anti-Taylor. This group was heavily funded by the government of Guinea to fight Charles Taylor and his government. Through the support of Guinea, LORD invaded Liberia from the northern flank of the country. This was in April 1999. LORD made significant gains against Taylor in the north, and in a short period of time, they began to advance towards the capital, Monrovia. President Charles Taylor did not fold his arms to watch the invasion of his country and thus fought back. In this fight, there were casualties, with the civilian population again being the principal victims. Liberia was again back to the path of war, and the major reason for this war was what was described as the excesses of their president, Charles Taylor. There was another regime of fear and panic in Liberia. At the time, Liberians thought that the emergence of Taylor as president would end all hostilities in the country. Indeed, Liberians were wrong. While the government of Charles Taylor was battling to contend the invasion of Liberia by Lord, another group emerged with the name Movement for Democracy in Liberia, known for short as MODEL. This group was also out to fight Taylor and his government and to retaliate Taylor's excesses. They invaded southern Liberia and quickly conquered most of the south. By their control of the south and the control of the north by Lord, Taylor was only left to control only a third of Liberia. He was no more in charge of the whole of the country, as critical parts of the country were under siege. In his bid to fight back, Taylor committed more wrongs. He was in a siege and had many centrifugal forces to battle with. So much had again been lost to the Second War, with Taylor at the center and reason for the hostilities. Liberians had again moved in droves to neighboring countries to seek refuge under severely excruciating and near inhuman circumstances. The Second Liberian Civil War resulted in the death of over 50,000 people and the internal displacement of thousands more. The conflict saw the widespread use of child soldiers by both Taylor and Lord. The people of Liberia had already gone through a lot, and Africa and the world were not ready to allow the suffering to be repeated in the exact proportion it was done in the First War. So calls were made for Charles Taylor to resign from office to allow peace to reign in Liberia, since Charles Taylor was the reason for the return of hostilities in the country. Charles Taylor initially resisted the call for his resignation. He maintained that he had not served out the tenure lawfully given to him by law. He vowed that he would complete his tenure come rain, come shine. But the calls for his resignation were really loud and came from quarters that were difficult for Taylor to ignore or treat with levity. One of the persons that called for Taylor to resign was the then President of America, George W. Bush Jr. He was clear at a press conference in Washington preparatory to his visit to Africa that Charles Taylor had to go. He added that America would not tolerate any further stay in the Liberian government house by Charles Taylor. There were other voices calling for Taylor to resign. Some voices came from Africa and from the streets of Liberia. The seat of power became too hot for Taylor to continue. For this reason, and perhaps sensing a forceful invasion and other indices of danger, Taylor resigned from office in August 2003. Taylor's resignation was seen as a huge relief for the beleaguered nation of Liberia. By his resignation, there was jubilation on the streets of Monrovia and other major cities in Liberia, and joyful celebration trickled down to the innermost part of the country. The people had seen so much in the hands of Taylor and his group, and the resignation of Taylor was good news to them and to the neighboring countries, to Liberia, and to the whole of Africa. Taylor then left Liberia to Nigeria on exile and was hosted by the Nigerian government under President Olusegun Obasanjo, who was the President of the Federal Republic of Nigeria at the time. With the agreement of President Obasanjo and Governor Donald Duke of Cross River State, Taylor was accommodated in Calabar, Cross River, by the seaside throughout the period of his exile. Following the resignation of Charles Taylor, the reins of power was taken over by his deputy, Moses Blah. Moses was the president of Liberia for only 2 months, and on 14th October 2003, he handed over to a United Nations-backed transition government headed by Gilday Bryant. Bryant was sworn in as chairman of the transitional government, and the major assignment of the committee was the conduct of democratic elections for a new president to emerge for the country. The Accra Comprehensive Peace Agreement was signed by the warring parties a week later, marking the political end of the conflict and beginning Liberia's transition to democracy. The National Transitional Government, led by interim President Gilday Bryant, governed the country until the 2005 general election. Several persons contested for the office of president, but Helen Johnson Sirleaf won the election and became the first female president in Africa. On being sworn in, Helen governed the country and did her best to restore peace to Liberia. It appears that, at first, Helen Johnson Sirleaf was not disposed to making any application for the arrest and trial of Charles Taylor, but it also appears that she came under intense pressure to do so, namely, to make a formal application as an independent country and member state of the United Nations and signatory to the Charter of the International Criminal Court for the arrest and prosecution of Charles Taylor. On 17th March 2006, Helen Johnson Sirleaf submitted an official request to the government of the Federal Republic of Nigeria for the extradition of Charles Taylor. The request was granted on the 25th of March 2006 by the government, then led by Olusegun Obasanjo, but with slight variation to the extent that Taylor will only be released and not extradited, as there was no extradition treaty existing between both countries at the time. Taylor was thus due to stand trial in the special court for Sierra Leone. 3 days after Nigeria announced its intent to release Taylor to Liberia, Taylor disappeared from his seaside residence in Calabar, Cross River State, but he was apprehended by security forces en route to Liberia. His Range Rover bearing a Nigerian diplomatic passport was stopped by border guards and Taylor's identity was uncovered. He was arrested and handed over to soldiers of the United Nations mission in Liberia, who then moved him by helicopter to Freetown, Sierra Leone, where he was delivered to the special court for Sierra Leone. Several persons testified against Taylor at the tribunal, and tons of documents were tendered against him. In the end, Taylor was found guilty for commission of war crimes and crimes against humanity. He was sentenced to 50 years imprisonment. He was 65 years at the time of the sentence, making his sentence effectively a life sentence, as he would be 115 years old at the time he served out his 50-year jail term. On 15th October 2013, Taylor was moved to Britain, where he began his prison term at the HM Prison Frankland in County Durham, England. His imprisonment brought to reality the confinement of Liberia's most dreaded warlord of all time. Charles Taylor was at the heart of the First Liberian Civil War and was also the cause of the Second Liberian Civil War. Each of these wars were bloody, with scores of lives and properties lost, while the country was left with scars of various and unimaginable proportion. Thanks for watching this edition of Back in History, and do remember to subscribe to the channel or follow the page for regular notification on every new video. I am your friend and host, Ekemini Udim.